Okay, so, like, are you ready to get into some really complex history today? Because we're diving deep, really deep into the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Absolutely. And it's not just history, it's alive, this conflict. I mean, look around, you see its echoes in international relations everywhere,
Yeah.
right? Colonialism, these institutions trying to like keep the peace but struggling, and then these huge forces, nationalism, people being pushed off their land. It's well, it's essential to understand all of this.
You're so right. It's not some like dusty old textbook thing. This stuff is playing out right now all over the world. So for anyone who wants to, get IR, like really get it, this period, this conflict, it's like a masterclass.
Yeah, and what hits you right away is how this conflict shows you the weight of historical injustice, like how it just keeps affecting things. It makes you really think twice about all those IR theories we take for granted.
Yeah, totally. And that's what we're trying to do in this deep dive, right? We're zeroing in on the time from the late 1800s up to 1948, which is, well, that's when the Nakba happened. We're using a bunch of different sources, historical stuff, to see how power dynamics and this deep history of injustice, how that shaped everything. It's about going way beyond the simple stories you usually hear.
And from what we're seeing in these sources, to really get this history, you got to have, well, I'd call it intellectual courage. You got to be ready to face some uncomfortable truths about how one society got built and another got, well, disrupted and displaced.
Okay, so intellectual courage, right? What's that mean for us, like as people studying international relations?
It means we got to go further than those usual IR frameworks.
Hmm.
Realism, liberalism, even constructivism. They don't quite grasp this conflict fully. They often just kind of, well, they accept how states are formed without looking at the violence, the inequality baked into colonial situations.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
they take the state for granted.
Right. It's just there, like, oh, this state just appeared. These theories, they don't dig into the messy, often violent fights over how states come about,
Right.
especially when you've got colonialism in the mix, people being pushed off their land, all that.
That's why our sources are like pointing us toward post-colonial theory and decolonial thinking. These lenses help you connect the dots between like old school colonialism and who has power in the world today. It's not like traditional IR. This is about.
It's about how those power imbalances from colonial times, they're still shaping things, how people were displaced, how the colonizers and the colonized, they're still dealing with that messed up power dynamic.
Exactly. And that's this whole story, right? It's,
Yeah.
oh, and this is huge. Our sources really emphasize this. The way this conflict gets talked about, it's so uneven.
Totally uneven. Like Palestinian experiences, they're often pushed aside as just like stories, just narratives. But then the official Israeli history, that's presented as like solid fact, the truth. And that right there, that's colonial thinking, right? It's who gets to decide what's real, what matters.
And that brings us to what we're doing here. In this deep dive, we have to put Palestinian experiences front and center.
Not as just one side, but as essential voices that have been silenced, voices that are key to understanding how this dispossession happened. We've got to like decolonize the way we think about this whole period.
Totally. Okay, so to do that, we got to start with what Palestine was like before Zionism comes into the picture.
Yeah, set the scene. And our sources, they're showing us Ottoman Palestine in the late 19th century, right? It was this vibrant place, super diverse, and the people were connected to the land in this deep, deep way.
Yeah.
It wasn't some empty space waiting for people to come in, That whole land without a people idea, it's just not true.
Okay, so let's get specific. What did Palestine actually look like back then? Who was living there?
So by the 1880s, you've got about 500,000 people living in Ottoman Palestine, mostly Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians. They'd been there for centuries, like generations upon generations. There was also an indigenous Jewish community, smaller, but with its own long history there too.
But it wasn't just like one big group of people, right?
Yeah.
There was diversity within Palestinian society too.
Oh, tons of diversity. You had these powerful families in the cities, the notables. Then most people were farmers working the land, tied to it through family and tradition. And then you've got the Bedouin communities, totally different way of life. Religious scholars, merchants, artisans. It was complex, a real mix.
The economy, it was mainly agricultural, right? It sounds like that connection to the land was, well, it was more than just practical.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about food on the table. Agriculture in Ottoman Palestine. It was woven into everything, their social life, culture, even religion. It was a way of life that had been shaped over centuries, understanding the land, the seasons, everything. And that's why later on when people were forced off the land, it was so traumatic. It was like ripping apart their whole world.
We hear about land ownership being pretty complicated back then, right? Like a mix of private property, shared use rights, and land controlled by the state. How did that all work?
It was tricky. Private ownership was becoming more common, especially with those Tanzimat reforms the Ottomans were doing, trying to modernize their government, make it easier to collect taxes. But a lot of villages still had these shared use rights, like for grazing their animals, that kind of thing. And then there's the Ottoman Land Code of 1858. The idea was to get everyone to register their land officially. But a lot of peasants, they didn't trust the government, or they wanted to avoid taxes, so they didn't register. And that came back to bite them later, because Zionist groups looking to buy up land, they exploited that. Land without a clear title, it was easier to take.
Wow. So this well-intentioned law, it actually ended up making things worse for Palestinians in the long run. That's wild. So we've got this complex land situation, but what about the social structure beyond that? What about the Hamula system we hear about?
The Hamula, that was everything. It's like the extended family, the clan, especially the villages. That was how society was organized. These kinship networks, they were like safety nets. They provided support, a sense of belonging. Villages were often built around these Hamulas. And then you have the big cities, right? Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Nablus. These were the hubs, the centers of government, trade, culture. They connected everything, brought people from different backgrounds together.
So we've got this snapshot of Palestine in the late 1800s, but things were changing fast, right? Global trade was expanding, the Ottomans were trying to reform, and then there's this growing influence from Europe. How did those forces start to change Palestinian society?
Huge changes, yeah. They started growing more cash crops, things like citrus fruits for export. That meant they were more connected to, global markets, European markets. But that also made them more vulnerable to those outside forces. The Ottoman reforms, well, they were meant to modernize things, but they often messed with traditional power structures, caused some chaos. And then there's this European influence, right, in their economy, their culture. Palestinians were exposed to new ways of thinking, new stuff to buy. The 1858 land code we talked about, that was partly a response to all these pressures trying to make their land system more modern, more European.
Right, and amidst all this, you have the Nada, the Arab Renaissance. It sounds like a pretty exciting time intellectually and culturally. How did that movement shape how Palestinians saw themselves, their identity?
The Nada, yeah, it was like this wave of energy across the Arab world, this rediscovering of their own culture and language. And Palestine was right in the middle of it. They were starting literary societies, newspapers were popping up everywhere, and more people were getting educated. It gave them tools to articulate their own identity in a world that was changing so fast, especially with all this pressure from outside.
So were Palestinians already thinking of themselves as Palestinians back then, or was their identity still, taking shape?
It was evolving, yeah. After the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, they started participating more in Ottoman politics, sending representatives to parliament, debating the future of the empire. But at the same time, they were becoming more aware of themselves as Palestinians. They were tied to that specific land, their shared culture, their history. It wasn't fully formed yet, this national identity, but the seeds were there. And later, when Zionism starts to become a threat, that's when this identity really crystallizes.
So you've got this complex society, deep roots, changing fast and starting to figure out their own identity. And then comes Zionism, a movement that started in Europe but was all about Palestine. How did those two worlds collide? And what kind of tensions did it create right from the start?
It's crucial to understand this. Zionism, it comes out of 19th century Europe. You've got anti-Semitism running rampant, Jewish emancipation failing in a lot of places, and this rise of nationalism everywhere. Zionism, it was a response to that, trying to create a safe haven, a Jewish state, as a solution to this persecution.
Yeah.
But, and here's the thing, it was also shaped by how Europeans saw the rest of the world, especially their colonies. It's like even as they're trying to escape oppression, they're kind of, replicating it.
So you've got this idea of freedom for European Jews, but it comes at the expense of the Palestinians who are already living there. That's a pretty fundamental tension. Was that intentional, or were they just not aware of what was happening on the ground in Palestine?
Good question. Early Zionist thinkers, like Theodor Herzl, they weren't really engaging with the people actually living there. Like Herzl's famous book, Der Judenstaat. it lays out this vision for Jewish self-determination, right? But it's totally framed by European ideas of nationalism. And it's got this almost colonial view of Palestine, like it's this empty land, ripe for development, just waiting for European Jews to come in and modernize it.
So, like, they were looking at Palestine through these European colonial glasses, and that really shaped the first waves of Zionist immigration, right? Those aliyahs, starting in the 1880s. This wasn't just like individual families looking for a new home. It was something much bigger, much more intentional.
Absolutely. It was the beginning of settler colonialism. And it was different from, like, the British taking over India, for example.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about resources or profits. The goal of Zionism was to change who lives in Palestine, to make it a Jewish majority, and eventually to create a Jewish state.
Yeah.
They were focused on building this new nation. And the existing Arab population, well, they were kind of like an obstacle to that vision.
And part of building this new society, it meant setting up institutions that were only for Jews, like the Jewish National Fund, right? How did those institutions contribute to the bigger picture, the displacement of the Palestinians?
And those institutions, they were key. I mean, they were setting up a whole separate system, right?
Yeah.
And it was built on this idea of exclusion. Like the Jewish National Fund, created in 1901, its whole purpose was to buy land in Palestine. But get this, the JNF's rules said that any land they bought, it could only belong to Jews forever. Non-Jews could never own it. And that was deliberate. It was about creating a permanent Jewish presence, making sure Palestinians couldn't get a foothold, And then there was this idea of Hebrew labor. It meant they only wanted to hire Jewish workers, shutting out Palestinians from jobs, all this separation. It created this huge imbalance, and it pushed Palestinians further and further to the margins.
So from the beginning, you've got this system that's unequal, built on segregation. How did Palestinians respond to all this, to Zionism taking root and these new institutions being created?
At first, there was some confusion. They didn't fully grasp what Zionism was all about. But as more land was sold, as they started to see what was happening, the threat to their lives, their future, they started to resist. At first, it was mostly local, like peasants fighting to hold on to their land. But by the early 1900s, it was getting more organized. You've got newspapers in Arabic speaking out against Zionism. They're sending petitions to the Ottoman government, complaining about the land being sold, the immigration. Palestinian leaders, they were starting to see that their whole world was being, transformed. And it scared them. They knew it was an existential threat to their way of life.
So even these early years, you see this pattern emerging. You've got these separate institutions, land being taken away, Palestinians starting to fight back. And then there's Zionism playing the long game, trying to get the powerful European empires on their side. But wasn't there this huge contradiction at the heart of the whole Zionist project?
Oh, yeah, a big one. They wanted a Jewish state, right? But the people living in Palestine were overwhelmingly Arab. Even if they didn't always say it out loud, the Zionist leaders, they knew that they had to deal with this, what they call the Arab question. It was this impossible problem, How do you create a Jewish state when most of the people who live there aren't Jewish? And that question, it was never really answered, not honestly anyway. And it led to the displacement of the Palestinians.
It's like the seeds of the Nakba were already there, sown in these early years, in the very nature of the Zionist project. Okay, let's move on to the British Mandate period. How did British colonialism make these existing tensions even worse, in a way that benefited the Zionists?
When Britain conquered Palestine in World War I between 1917 and 1918, and then set up their mandate in 1922, that changed everything. The British, they were in charge now. And for 30 years, their policies and actions, they mostly favored the Zionists, while they were holding back the Palestinians. They were supposed to be impartial, but they weren't. And that created the conditions for what happened in 1948.
And then there's the Balfour Declaration in 1917. It's like a perfect example of how colonial powers thought back then.
Oh, for sure. The British government, they just declared that they support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. They just decided that, they didn't ask the people living there, didn't get their consent. And at the time, Palestinians made up like 90% of the population. The declaration, it's got this part about protecting the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities, but it's so telling, right? Palestinians, they're just non-Jewish communities. They don't even mention their political rights or their right to decide their own future. It's just classic colonialism.
And it wasn't just empty words, right? It actually became part of the Mandate for Palestine, which the League of Nations gave to Britain in 1922. How did that make things even more unbalanced?
The mandate, it took that whole Balfour Declaration and made it official.
Right.
Britain was now supposed to create a Jewish national home in Palestine, even though it's mostly Arab, that created this massive power imbalance. Britain, they were supposed to be governing Palestine, but they were also supposed to be helping create a Jewish state. It's like it was rigged from the start against the Palestinians.
Right. And then you look at British policy during the Mandate period, immigration, land, governance. It was all about helping the Yishuv, the Jewish community, grow and get stronger while they were keeping the Palestinians down. Can you give us some concrete examples of how they did that?
Oh, yeah. Take immigration. In the 1930s, you had more and more Jews trying to get into Palestine, fleeing the Nazis, right? The British, they made it easy for them. But Palestinians, they were asking for democracy, for a system where the majority, them, would have a say. That would have meant limiting Jewish immigration. But the British, they shut that down. They knew that if Palestinians had real political power, it would mess with the whole plan of creating a Jewish state. And then land policy. The British, they were supposed to be regulating how land was sold. But their rules actually ended up benefiting the Zionists. Like they'd recognize these legal titles that absentee landlords had, people who didn't even live in Palestine, making it easier for Zionists to buy up huge chunks of land. Even economically, the British were favoring the Jewish communities. They were building infrastructure, giving out contracts, all in areas where Jews were settling.
It's like they were setting up two totally different systems, one for each community.
Exactly. And then there's the Jewish Agency. Well, it was like the Zionist government in waiting. The British, they gave them all this power. They could run their own administration, schools, even had their own little army. They were basically building a state within a state.
Mm-hmm.
And the Palestinians, they weren't allowed to do anything like that. Their organizations, they were kept weak.
So for the whole Mandate period, you have this obvious bias, the British favoring one side, stopping the Palestinians from deciding their own future. And when Palestinians did fight back, what happened?
Well, whether they were protesting peacefully, going on strike, or taking up arms, the British, they cracked down hard. Classic colonial playbook,
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest example of that is the Great Arab Revolt. From
Yeah.
1936 to 1939, it started with a general strike, 6 months long, the whole Palestinian society united. Then it turned into a full-on armed rebellion. But the British, they crushed it. They sent in troops, imposed curfews, blew up people's houses, arrested everyone. By the time it was over, Palestinian society was exhausted, their leaders killed, exiled, or imprisoned.
So it's like right when the Zionist movement is getting stronger, the Palestinians are, well, they're getting weaker.
Yeah. And right before World War II, that's when the Peel Commission comes in. In 1937, they recommend partitioning Palestine. That's a big deal, a turning point.
Why was that such a big deal?
Before that, it was all about a Jewish national home within Palestine, right?
Yeah.
But the Peel Commission, they said, let's just split the whole thing up. It didn't work out right then. Their specific plan was a mess. But the idea of partition, that's what stuck. It got legitimized, even though most Palestinians were against it.
Okay, so partition is on the table now. And then the British, they put out the white paper of 1939. It looked like they were trying to change course a little, putting limits on Jewish immigration and land purchases. Why the sudden change of heart? And did it actually make a difference?
Well, the Arab Revolt was still going strong, and World War II was looming. So the British, they were getting nervous. They needed to keep things calm. So the white paper, it was an attempt to, appease the Palestinians. But the Zionists, they hated it. They saw it as a betrayal. And the thing is, by then, they were already pretty well established, the Yishuv. They had their institutions, their economy, their unofficial army. And the white paper, they didn't really enforce it consistently, especially with the war going on. So, yeah, it slowed down Zionism a bit, but it didn't change the big picture.
So basically, for 30 years, whether they meant to or not, the British, they created a system that screwed over the Palestinians. And that set the stage for everything that came next. But let's not forget about the Palestinians themselves, their agency, their resilience. Our sources are pretty clear that Palestinian nationalism, it wasn't just reacting to Zionism and British rule. It was about building their own institutions, their own future, even with all these obstacles.
That's such an important point. It's easy to, fall into this narrative where Palestinians are just passive victims.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't. They were fighting for their rights, building their own society, even as they were being pushed down.
So what did that look like? What were some of the ways they resisted? How did they build those institutions?
Well, we talked about the early resistance, right? The local stuff, protecting their land, forming groups in the cities. And the Palestinian press, that was huge. It helped spread their ideas,
Yeah.
Create a sense of unity.
And then you have those bigger movements like the Palestinian Arab Congress and the Arab Executive. What were they all about?
Those are big steps toward a national movement. The Palestinian Arab Congress, starting in the 1920s, it brought together leaders from all over, different factions, and they came up with a unified list of demands. They wanted independence, and they wanted to stop Zionism. The Arab executive, they were the main group representing Palestinians to the British and to the world. Their goal was self-determination, to control their own destiny, and to prevent a Jewish state from being forced on them.
And then there's this figure who keeps coming up, Haj Amin al-Husseini and the Supreme Muslim Council. How did they fit into all of this?
Haj Amin al-Husseini, he was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a big deal religiously, and he was also the head of the Supreme Muslim Council. Now, officially that was a religious body, but in reality they had a lot of power. They ran the Waqf, which is like religious endowments. They had schools, courts. They were providing social services. It was like a parallel government running alongside the British, sometimes clashing with them.
And what about Palestinian women? Were they involved in this national movement too?
Oh, absolutely. They had their own organizations like the Arab Women's Association. They were protesting, running social programs, writing, They were also the ones keeping their culture alive, their traditions. It shows you that this wasn't just a movement of men. Everyone was involved. Everyone was fighting for their future.
And then you have the Great Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939. That seems like a major, major event in the history of Palestinian resistance.
Yeah, it was. It started because of, all the stuff we've been talking about. More Jews coming in, more land being taken, the British not listening, the general strike. That was just the beginning. Then it exploded into a full-blown rebellion. And for a while, the rebels, they actually controlled big parts of the countryside.
But the British, they crushed it, right?
They sure did. It was brutal. And that had consequences. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, wounded, imprisoned. Their leaders were gone. Their society disrupted. By the time World War II rolls around, they're weakened. And the Zionists, they're getting stronger and more organized.
So even though they were building institutions, fighting back, the Great Arab Revolt, it sets them back big time. The Arab Higher Committee, they try to regroup after the war, but it's not the same playing field anymore.
Right. The Zionists, they'd built up all this support internationally, especially in the U.S., and they had their own military force. The Arab Higher Committee, they didn't have that kind of power. They were trying to stop partition, but the momentum was against them.
It's pretty remarkable that they kept fighting for their rights, even under those conditions. Okay, let's talk about World War II and the Holocaust. These were obviously world-changing events, and our sources say they were a turning point for Palestine too, in a really tragic way.
Yeah, World War II and especially the Holocaust, they changed everything. You have this genocide, this horrific crime against European Jews, and the world is, they're trying to figure out what to do. And the Zionists, they're very smart about how they use this moment.
So they connected the suffering of the Holocaust to their goal of a Jewish state.
Exactly. They're saying, look, these survivors, they need a safe haven, and Palestine, that's where it should be. And after the Holocaust, a lot of people, they felt like they had a moral obligation to help Jewish refugees. And a Jewish state in Palestine, that seemed like the answer.
But that narrative that it was just about helping refugees, it ignores the fact that Palestine wasn't empty. There were people already living there.
Right. And the Zionists, they weren't really open to other solutions, like resettling refugees in other countries. Their goal was Palestine, and that meant displacing the Palestinians who were already there. It put Palestinians in this awful position, right? They're being asked to give up their homeland because of a crime committed in Europe, a crime they had nothing to do with. And if they resisted, they were accused of being anti-Semitic, which is just wrong.
And then with the war, Britain, they're not the superpower they used to be. And Zionist paramilitary groups, they start taking advantage of that.
Yeah, Britain's empire was crumbling, they're broke, and they've got all these anti-colonial movements popping up. And in Palestine, groups like the Haganah, Irgun, Lehi, they're getting stronger, more violent. They're attacking the British, trying to force them out, and they're attacking Palestinians too. The King David Hotel bombing in 1946, that's a terrible example of this.
So you've got this chaos, the British are losing control, and in 1947, they decide to just wash their hands of the whole thing. They hand it over to the UN.
Exactly. They couldn't figure out what to do, so they just dumped it on the UN. And by then, with the Holocaust so fresh in everyone's minds, the world was much more sympathetic to the idea of a Jewish state. The timing, it couldn't have been worse for the Palestinians.
It's almost too painful to think about. The victims of the Holocaust, their suffering, it gets used to justify the dispossession of another people, the Palestinians. And that brings us to the UN partition plan. How did that come about, and what did it actually say?
So the UN, they create this special committee on Palestine, UNSCOSCOP, but it was biased from the start. No Arab or Muslim countries were on the committee. And the Arab Higher Committee, they boycotted it because they didn't trust the process. Then UNSCOP comes out with this plan to partition Palestine, and the UN General Assembly votes for it in November 1947. That's Resolution 181.
And that partition plan, it wasn't exactly fair, was it?
Not at all. They proposed splitting Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. But they gave the Jewish state 56% of the land, even though Jews owned less than 7% of the land at that time. Now, they were only about a third of the population.
So most of the land is going to the minority population. And what about the people who would be living in that Jewish state?
Well, it was supposed to be a Jewish state, right? But there were still going to be a lot of Arabs living there. They were almost half the population. So you've got this built-in tension. Can you really have a Jewish state when almost half the people aren't Jewish?
It's no wonder the Palestinians rejected it. What were their reasons for saying no to the plan?
They saw it as a violation of their basic rights. They were the majority, they were the indigenous people, and they had the right to self-determination, to decide their own future. And this plan, it was basically legitimizing colonization. They saw it as giving away their land to solve a problem that wasn't theirs to solve.
And the UN, they didn't really have any way to enforce the plan, did they? What happened after the vote?
Right, the UN, they vote for partition, but they don't do anything to actually make it happen. And things on the ground, they just got worse. Fighting between Jews and Arabs, it just escalated. In April 1948, the Zionists started putting Plan Delay into action. That was their military strategy for taking control of the land that was supposed to be the Jewish state, and even more. The goal was to get rid of the Palestinians in those areas.
So even before Israel officially declared independence, they were already pushing Palestinians out.
Yeah, it was happening. And then there's the Deir Yassin massacre, April 9, 1948. Jewish paramilitary groups, they attacked this village and killed over 100 people. That sent shockwaves through the Palestinian community. People were terrified, and they started fleeing. By the time Israel declares independence on May 15, 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were already gone.
And the UN partition plan, this supposed solution, it just made things worse, didn't it?
Yeah. It was supposed to bring peace, but it just legitimized dispossession. It's like, the British, their policies favored the Zionists for 30 years, and then the UN, they come in and they rubber stamp it.
Okay, so now we have to talk about 1948. The war and the Nakba, the catastrophe that happened to the Palestinians. It's a pretty devastating story, and it's important to understand what actually happened.
It's a painful history, for sure. 1948, it's the year that Palestinian society is, shattered. Something like 750,000 Palestinians, more than half the population, they're either forced out or they flee in terror. Their villages are destroyed. Their lives are, everything is just ripped apart. That's the Nakba.
There's this story that gets repeated a lot, that the Arab leaders, they told Palestinians to leave their homes during the war. Our sources say that's not true. What does the evidence actually show?
There's zero proof that Arab leaders told Palestinians to leave en masse. Historians, they've looked at the archives, they've interviewed people who were there, and it's clear it was the Zionists who were pushing people out. Plan Dalet, remember. That was all about taking control of the land by emptying it of Palestinians. They used military force, they destroyed villages, and they did things to scare people into fleeing.
And you mentioned Plan Dalet earlier. That played a big role in all this, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Plan Dalet, it was their blueprint, their strategy. It was about more than just winning battles. It was about creating a Jewish state by making sure there were no Palestinians left in those areas. It was ethnic cleansing.
And it wasn't just the villages that were targeted. What about the cities, the Palestinian cities?
The cities, too. Jaffa, Haifa, Acre, Lydda, even parts of Jerusalem. These places had been Arab for centuries. And in 1948, they were emptied out. Zionist forces, they attack, they spread fear, and then they force people out. And it's not just ordinary people. It's the intellectuals, the business leaders, the people who make up a society. That's gone. Some people call it herbicide, the killing of a city.
And then all those Palestinian villages, they're destroyed, and Jewish settlements are built in their place.
Out of about 500 villages, over 400 of them are wiped off the map. Their houses are demolished. Their land is taken. And then the Israelis, they rename all these places with Hebrew names. It's like they're trying to erase the Palestinian history of the land. And then they pass laws to make sure Palestinians can't come back. The law of return says any Jew in the world can move to Israel and become a citizen. And the absentee property law, that lets them confiscate the property of the Palestinians who were expelled.
What about the Palestinians who stayed, the ones who ended up inside?